So I continue this video, and I'd like to present on interactional competence. I provide a brief interview on interactional competence, followed by a very quick history of that contextualizes interactional competence. And then I move on to a framework of IC, or interactional competence, and provide a review of it, I should say a rather critical review of that framework. And finally, I discuss authenticity and variability and connect it with interactional competence. So Saville-Troik in 1989 defined the interaction as an act of communication in which two of the three parties are or were interpreting the conversational exchange in different ways. It could be actually two parties as well. Doesn't make a big difference there, but it could be more than two parties. Now, the other interesting fact or the other interesting claim, let's say, that has been made about interactions is by Garrett and Pickering in 2004, who claim that humans are designed for dialogue rather than monologues. Now, this is against what Noam Chomsky has claimed. As early as 1965, Chomsky believed that a speaker's knowledge of language in the abstract, that's basically competence, and the way that in which that knowledge is realized in the production and interpretation of actual utterances are the two most important components of language. Now, knowledge here refers to, as I have discussed this before a few times, that internal capacity of humans that's basically, according to Chomsky, is in their DNA. And as a result, language itself is not necessarily an instrument for communication, but it's an instrument for expressing thoughts. Berwick and Chomsky, in their recent book published in 2015, said that language is used for internal thought as the cognitive glue that binds together other perceptual and information processing cognitive systems. In other words, language and that competence that we refer to as language is not necessarily something for communication, but it's for the expression of thoughts. On the other hand, according to the interactional competence frameworks, language is primarily a concept or a mechanism for communication rather than just expressing thoughts. So that's why, in my opinion, the idea of competence in Chomsky's theoretical frameworks has not been understood well. This knowledge of language, which a lot of linguists refer to as competence, is something that, according to Chomsky, is in DNA. That's why Chomsky says that language is an object of biology rather than linguistics. So he's talking about some sort of biological mechanism that gives rise to language. And that's something that we should take into consideration. Now, when it comes to interactional competence, Richard Young in 2011 provided a brief list of some of the attributes of this competency, which I quickly go through. Interactional competence, according to Young, has been studied in spoken interaction, although nonverbal aspects of spoken interaction are seen as important. So that's one of the dimensions that we need to take into account, and something that seems to differentiate IC from, let's say, communicative competence theoretical frameworks. I'll get back to the nonverbal aspect in the next slide. The next topic is the pragmatics of interaction, which are fundamental to interactional competence, and it's something that is also stressed in communicative competence models. Interactional competence is the construction of a shared mental context, and this is a differentiating feature of IC from other models and conceptualizations of language. Through the collaboration of all interactional partners, whereas in communicative competence, this sense of collaboration and the generation of language through this collaboration is absent. The context of an interaction includes the social, institutional, political, and historical circumstances. This is the context, actually, that extend beyond the horizon of a single interaction. Therefore, to make sense of a single interaction, it's very important to find out under what circumstances that interaction was made. So what we hear, it might be a simple sentence, but from interaction to interaction, from context to context, the meaning of the same sentence can be different. There is a very interesting paper on the role of nonverbal communication in humans. It was published by Robbins Berling in 1993 by the name of Primate Calls, Human Language and Nonverbal Communication. In this paper, which was critiqued by quite a few people, critiqued mostly positively, I should say, Berling claimed that human beings use at least two fundamentally different forms of communication. One includes language and some other closely related signals, the other most of our nonverbal communication. This second form of communication resembles the communication system of other primates much more closely than it resembles language, and it should be recognized as the primate communication system of the human species. This is a very interesting paper. I suggest that you take a look if you find time. It's really worth it because it provides us with a very interesting evolutionary overview of what nonverbal communications are and how and why they probably evolved for. I'll get back to this, the idea of nonverbal communication, and I'll show how they are and whether they are a part of interactional competence. Now, first, a brief history of interactional competence. In 1880s, when what we call the direct method was emerging, there was a stress and emphasis over the oral fluency or the development of the oral fluency of language learners. Then came the reform movement in which pronunciation, clear enunciation, and phonetics became the norm in language learning classrooms. Then around 1970s, as a response to Chomsky, Del Hymes proposed his communicative competence, and then came Halliday a little bit later, who proposed the idea of systemic functional linguistics, in which he discussed the functional aspects of language, and then people like Van Dyke, who looked at the other dimension of language, which is comprehension. Van Dyke specifically talked about discourse and text or context relationships. Then other people, some of whom collaborated with Van Dyke, like Walter Kinch, also expanded on the idea of discourse comprehension. In other videos, I have discussed Walter Kinch's construction integration model of comprehension. In 1980s and 1990s, this idea of interactional competence started to emerge. It was partly a response or a reaction to communicative competence, in which interaction was not very well stressed. One of the first people who talked about it was Cramsch, who in 1986 said interaction always entails negotiation, the negotiation of meaning. That's negotiating intending meanings, that is, adjusting one speech to the effect one intends to have on the listener. It entails anticipating the listener's response and possible misunderstandings, clarifying one's own and the other person's intentions. Now, I'm going to present a framework that discusses some of these, or maybe all of these components in fairly more details, and that's the framework that was proposed by Galaxy and Taylor. This framework has been proposed for language assessment, I should say. However, it's equally applicable to maybe classrooms, or it provides some good overview of what interactional competence is, and it also contextualizes it historically. At the bottom of this framework, you will see speech situation, or the macro context, which refers to the time and place of the communication and interaction. For example, if the speech situation is in a lecture theater versus a restaurant, this facet or variable can exert an influence over the language, the body language, and other aspects of interactions that the two or more interlocutors are using. The second variable at the bottom here is speech event, and this refers to one or a set of utterances, and things like conversations and dialogues can be subsumed under speech event. The idea of speech event and the speech situation and also the speech act, which I'm going to explain in a minute, come from John Austin's 1956 and 1962 writings, especially his influential book published in 1962 by the name of How to Do Things with Words. And if you really want to get a better idea about speech events and speech acts, that's the book that you should take a look. Finally, speech acts are sentences or utterances that serve a purpose. For example, requests, promises, apologies, etc. make speech acts. The other component of this framework is listener, and the other one is speaker. Now, as we are listening, we do a few things just to ascertain, in other words, to assure the speaker that we are following them and the act of communication can continue. Here is one of these major components that's called interactive listening, in which we use continuers, we do back channeling, and also a comprehension check takes place. Comprehension check is usually done by speakers, but sometimes by listeners. For example, when the listener says, "Oh, let me check if I understand you correctly here," that's a comprehension check, and that signals to the speaker that the listener is trying to contribute to the conversation, is trying to understand the speaker. Continuers are words or phrases, sometimes interjections, pretty much like back channeling, that show that the listener is following. For example, like, "Oh, I see. Oh, that's how it works," and things like that. Back channeling are also some interjections, and they are perhaps specifically interjections that show that the listener is following the speaker and understands the message. Something like, "Oh, yeah, okay," things like that. They could also be words, but they most often refer to interjections. I mean, it's not a very exact science. Some people say that it's words. Some people say it constitutes both words and interjections. The other concept here is breakdown and repair. When the conversation or the interaction starts to break down, then the interlocutor make an attempt to stop it from breaking down. How do they do this? Some of the strategies that can be used are recasts by yourself and other people. Or recasting is like repeating what you have said or paraphrasing it. By paraphrasing it into a simpler structure or into a different structure that you assume that the other interlocutor will understand properly. Sometimes an utterance is jointly created by the speaker and the listener. This indicates that they know what they're talking about and they're making a joint attempt to create meaning. Then comes nonverbal communication. I just mentioned that in the previous slide. Nonverbal communication has a wide range. It ranges from posture, that's how we sit or how we stand. That's basically how we position our bodies can affect the act of communication. Sometimes we can sit such that the interlocutor would assume that we're not really interested, and that's very obvious from the posture of our body. Sometimes we sit in a posture that shows that, we're very interested, and as a result, the interlocutor wants to continue to talk to us. Laughters and smiles is also another signal that we are engaged in the conversation. And there is a large amount of literature on facial expressions and eye contacts, and I'm afraid in this framework they have not been discussed that much. I think at the interest of time, I would like to get back to these concepts later because they really need a more profound treatment. But facial expressions and eye contacts are important. Modern technologies such as eye tracking can reveal different types of eye contacts or gaze behavior, not only during speaking but listening as well as some face reading software packages which have been developed. In the course that we're now going through, that's the Oracy course, we do talk about some of those technologies and we use them in one of the sessions in the class. Finally, topic management and turn management are two other attributes that have been highlighted in this framework. Topic management includes the ability to initiate and extend the topic and then shift across different topics and close a topic. Similarly, turn management is actually a very similar concept to topic management, in which the interlocutor has the ability to initiate a turn and then maintain that turn and end it. Sometimes when we're speaking with someone, when that person pauses, we immediately start to speak. That little gap is like a window opportunity. A gap in the interlocutor's speech is like a window of opportunity for us, and it could probably signal us that we can start our talk. But it's not always like this. Sometimes the interlocutor loves what he's or she is talking about and keeps latching on, and he doesn't give you an opportunity to speak. Therefore, interruptions can happen, and as the other person speaking, you might interrupt them and say, look, I want to say something, or I don't think I agree with that, or something like that, or I want to add to it, or something like that, to signal that you also want to make a contribution to that conversation in any form. Now, this account of interactional competence or spoken interaction does not exactly include a psychological mechanism that would bind these different components that have been highlighted here together. It doesn't also have a neurological sort of explanation for how these components emerge and how they interact with each other and perhaps influence on each other. This is just a brief critique of the framework.